Tonight, in the heart of a forgotten town, a secret buried for over a decade is about to be uncovered. A tragedy that no one fully understood. A fire that left behind only ashes and unanswered questions. But what if the real mystery wasn't in what was lost, but in what survived? A girl vanished without a trace. A family torn apart by betrayal. And a truth so shocking that it will change everything. As the past unravels, lies will collapse, masks will fall, and those who seemed innocent may be guilty of the worst sins. But the biggest question remains: what really happened that night? Stay until the end, because nothing is what it seems. And if you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Subscribe now and comment below. What do you think the real secret is? The fire came in the dead of night, swallowing everything in its path. The wind howled through the darkened sky, feeding the flames as they consumed the house on the edge of town. Smoke curled into the air, thick and suffocating, carrying the scent of burning wood and something more. Something raw, something human. People gathered at a distance, some shouting, others frozen in place, watching as the inferno tore through the old Carter estate like a beast unchained. Firefighters fought against the blaze, their silhouettes flickering in the orange glow. But deep inside that house, amid the collapsing beams and charring walls, something or someone was missing. Nathan Carter stood outside, his face smeared with soot, his hands trembling. His brother, Lucas, gripped his shoulder with enough force to leave bruises, shaking him violently. "Where is she? Where is Catherine?" The words barely registered in Nathan's mind, drowned beneath the roar of the fire and the sirens that screamed in the night. The world moved in slow motion as the firefighters shouted to each other, dousing the last of the flames. And then silence. No body was recovered. No sign of Catherine Carter or their daughter, Evelyn. It was as if they had been erased by the fire itself. The police arrived before dawn, combing through the wreckage. Statements were taken, hushed conversations exchanged between officers. Lucas paced back and forth, his face contorted in fury and grief. Nathan, however, stood eerily still, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't make sense," Lucas muttered. "They should be here. He stopped when a fire investigator emerged from the wreckage. His expression was grave. "We found something." Nathan's stomach twisted into knots as they led him to a section of the house that had collapsed inward. There, among the debris, was a single small shoe, charred at the edges, but unmistakably belonging to a child. Nathan felt the air leave his lungs. The official story was written that morning. Catherine and Evelyn Carter perished in the fire. Their bodies, the authorities claimed, had been consumed by the flames. Tragic but final. The town mourned and life moved on. But something didn't sit right. Nathan knew it. Lucas knew it. And someone else in town knew it too. Someone who, years later, would shatter the illusion that this was ever just an accident. The first anonymous note arrived 10 years later. It was left at the local police station, tucked beneath a pile of paperwork on Detective Claire Reynolds' desk. No signature, no return address. Just a single, chilling sentence scrawled in uneven ink. "She's still alive." Claire had seen her share of cold cases, of families clinging to hope when there was none left. But something about this note, about the way it was placed right on her desk, unsettled her. She traced her fingers over the paper, feeling the pressure of the pen strokes, the urgency in the way the letters pressed into the page. Was this a prank? A cruel joke? Or was there something much, much darker lurking beneath the surface? She pulled up the old case files, scanning the reports. The Carter fire had been ruled accidental. The official findings stated that faulty electrical wiring had sparked the blaze. But as she read through the testimonies, discrepancies began to surface. Nathan's statement contradicted itself in small but significant ways. Lucas Carter had never stopped searching, even after the case was closed. And then there was the biggest inconsistency of all. There had been no skeletal remains found in the fire. Claire's pulse quickened. If there were no remains, then how could they be sure Catherine and Evelyn had died? Her fingers hovered over the phone before she finally dialed. The line rang once, twice, before a gruff voice answered. Nathan Carter. Silence. Then Claire spoke. I need to ask you about your wife and daughter. Nathan didn't respond for several seconds. Then, just as she was about to repeat herself, he said, That fire took everything from me. Detective, there's nothing left to say. The line went dead. Claire exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. She wasn't convinced. Not yet. She needed to see the Carter estate for herself. The house had long since been abandoned, its remains covered in ivy and decay. The smell of wet ash still lingered in the air, even after a decade. Claire stepped carefully over fallen beams, her flashlight sweeping across the wreckage. A part of her expected to find nothing, a quiet, forgotten ruin. But then, in the silence, she heard something, a rustle. Not the wind, not an animal. Something or someone was moving inside the ruins. Her heart pounded as she followed the sound, stepping deeper into the wreckage. The air was thick with dust, her breath shallow as she pushed aside broken furniture. And then she saw it. A footprint. Small. Recent. A child's. Her stomach dropped. Who had been here? A flash of movement at the corner of her eye. Just a blur, gone before she could react. Claire spun, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. But she was alone. Or at least, that's what she told herself as she left the estate that night. She didn't see the eyes watching her from the shadows. She didn't hear the whisper of breath as someone, or something, moved deeper into the ruins, vanishing into the darkness. The night pressed heavy against Claire's skin as she stepped away from the Carter estate, her mind racing with the weight of what she had just seen. The footprint, small, recent, unmistakably belonging to a child. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The fire had taken Evelyn Carter a decade ago. And yet, standing there amid the ruins, Claire couldn't shake the eerie certainty that someone had been there, watching, listening, hiding. The cold air gnawed at her skin as she reached her car, the old dirt road stretching in both directions into the silent darkness. There was no movement, no signs of life aside from the occasional rustle of the wind through the dying trees. Yet, something inside her told her she wasn't alone. She inhaled sharply, scanning her surroundings once more before forcing herself to get into the vehicle. The old case file sat open on the passenger seat, the black and white photograph of the Carter family staring up at her. Nathan, Catherine, and Evelyn. The perfect family, frozen in time, their smiles now carrying an unsettling weight. Claire traced her fingers over the image, focusing on the little girl at the center. If you're still out there, she whispered, I'll find you. The drive back to town was quiet, but Claire's thoughts were anything but. She played the case over in her mind, again and again, looking for the missing piece, the one thread that could unravel everything. The anonymous note had been the catalyst, forcing her to look deeper. Someone wanted her to know the truth, someone who knew more than they were willing to say. But who, and why now, after 10 long years? She gritted her teeth and made a sharp turn, not toward the station, but toward the home of the one man who had the most to lose if this investigation continued. Nathan Carter. The Carter residence sat on the outskirts of town, a modest but well-kept house, its windows dark except for a faint glow in the living room. Claire stepped out of her car, her boots crunching against the gravel driveway. She knocked twice, firm but not aggressive, and waited. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the shuffle of footsteps on the other side of the door, the sound of a lock clicking. The door creaked open, revealing Nathan's face, worn, tired, his features shadowed by the dim lighting behind him. His eyes flickered with something unreadable as he took her in. Detective, he said, his voice rough. It's late. Claire held up the case file. We need to talk. Nathan hesitated. There's nothing left to talk about. That's not true. She met his gaze, unwavering. Someone left me a note. Someone who claims your daughter is still alive. His jaw tensed. A flicker of something, anger, fear, guilt, passed through his expression before he stepped back, leaving the door open just enough for her to enter. Claire stepped inside, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the chill outside. The living room was neat, almost too neat, as if it had been carefully arranged to appear untouched. A glass of whiskey sat on the table, barely touched. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly bitter, like burnt coffee. Nathan walked to the fireplace, staring at the dying embers. "You should let this go," he said after a long pause. "I can't do that." Claire set the file on the coffee table, flipping it open to reveal the photos of the fire, the reports, the contradictions. There are too many unanswered questions. And now this. She slid the note toward him. "Someone wants the truth to come out. So tell me, Nathan, what really happened that night?" Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Nathan's fingers twitched at his sides, his shoulders tense. "You think I haven't spent every damn day asking myself the same thing?" He finally turned to her, his eyes dark with something deeper than grief. "You think I don't wake up every morning wondering if I could have done something differently? If I could have saved them?" Claire watched him carefully. "Then help me find out what really happened." Nathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time, Claire saw past the detached exterior, saw the exhaustion, the weight of 10 years of unanswered questions pressing down on him. He hesitated, then, with a slow, reluctant movement, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He tossed it onto the table between them. "Catherine kept a journal," he said quietly. "I never had the stomach to read all of it." Claire's pulse quickened as she picked up the notebook, the leather cover cracked with age. She flipped through the pages, scanning the handwriting. Elegant, rushed in some places, almost frantic in others. Then she saw it. The last entry. "I know what they're planning. I have to protect her, no matter what it takes." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Who was planning what? Nathan shook his head. "I don't know, but Catherine." She was scared, more scared than she ever let on. "I thought it was paranoia, stress, hell, I don't know. But then the fire happened, and she was just gone." Claire's grip tightened on the journal. "Catherine didn't die in that fire, did she?" Nathan didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I don't know." A shiver ran down Claire's spine. She closed the journal and stood. "I need to see Lucas." Nathan stiffened at the name, his expression darkening. "Lucas doesn't know anything." "Maybe he does," Claire countered. "Or maybe he's just better at hiding it than you are." Nathan's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded, looking away. "Be careful, detective. Not everyone wants the truth to come out." Claire met his gaze. "That's exactly why I won't stop." As she stepped out into the cold night, the notebook clutched in her hand. She felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Something had happened that night, something more than just a fire. And if Catherine had been trying to protect Evelyn, then who had she been protecting her from? The town of Ridgewood was quiet at night, a blanket of silence covering its winding streets and dimly lit storefronts. Claire drove with one hand on the wheel, the other clutching the notebook she had taken from Nathan Carter's house. She could still hear his voice, low and strained, warning her to let it go. But she wouldn't. Not now. Not after that final journal entry. "I know what they're planning. I have to protect her, no matter what it takes." Those words gnawed at Claire's mind like a relentless tide, eroding any doubts she might have had. Catherine Carter knew something. She was afraid of something, or someone. And if she had really died in the fire, then why hadn't her body or Evelyn's ever been found? Claire turned onto a side road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. Lucas Carter's house sat at the edge of town, a two-story colonial-style home that felt oddly out of place among the smaller, humbler houses surrounding it. It was well-maintained, pristine even. Too pristine, like someone had been trying too hard to keep up appearances. She parked in the driveway, stepping out into the crisp night air. The front porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the steps. She knocked twice, the sound echoing through the stillness. A moment later, the door opened just enough for Lucas Carter to peer through the crack. His blue eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked over her face before narrowing slightly. "Detective Reynolds," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something Claire couldn't quite place. "What a surprise." Claire held up the notebook. "We need to talk." Lucas exhaled through his nose, glancing behind him before stepping aside. "Come in." The inside of the house was immaculate, every piece of furniture perfectly arranged, not a single item out of place. It smelled faintly of cologne and old wood, the kind of scent that lingered in houses with too many locked doors and too many hidden truths. Lucas gestured toward the sitting area, but Claire remained standing. She cut straight to the point. "Tell me what happened the night of the fire." Lucas's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's a broad question." "Then let's narrow it down," Claire said. "Did Catherine ever mention being afraid of someone?" Lucas tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Fear is a strong word, but not the wrong one." Claire opened the notebook, flipping to the final entry. She read it aloud, watching his reaction carefully. "I know what they're planning. I have to protect her, no matter what it takes." Lucas didn't flinch, but something flickered in his eyes, something momentary and fleeting, gone as quickly as it had come. "That sounds like paranoia to me," he said. "Catherine always had an overactive imagination." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Is that why she disappeared?" Lucas let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Detective, this case has been closed for 10 years. I understand that you're looking for a story, but you won't find one here." "Then explain this," Claire said, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out the photograph she had taken at the Carter estate earlier that night. The footprint, small, recent. She placed it on the table between them. Lucas's expression didn't change, but his posture did. Subtle, a slight shift, a tension in his shoulders. "What am I looking at?" "Someone's been at the estate," Claire said. "And they're small. A child, maybe." Lucas picked up the photograph, studying it for a long moment before setting it down. "That house has been abandoned for years," he said. "Anyone could have gone through the wreckage. But not anyone could have left a footprint that size," Claire countered. "Not unless they were around Evelyn's age." Silence stretched between them, heavy, unspoken words dangling in the air. Then Lucas smiled, slow and practiced. "I think you should leave now, detective." Claire held his gaze for a long moment, searching for a crack in his composure. But Lucas Carter was a man who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. If he knew something, he wasn't going to give it up easily. She turned toward the door but paused just before stepping outside. "One last question." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "If Evelyn really died in that fire," Claire said, "then why did someone leave me a note saying she's still alive?" Lucas's smile faded, just for a second, but that second was enough. Without another word, Claire stepped out into the night, the door closing behind her with a quiet click. She exhaled sharply, her breath visible in the cold air. Lucas was hiding something, and she was going to find out what. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. A chill ran down her spine as she answered. Silence. Then a whisper, faint, almost too quiet to hear. "She's not safe." Claire's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" But the line went dead. She stared at the screen, her pulse thundering in her ears. Whoever had sent that note, whoever had been in that house, was watching. And they weren't done yet. The whisper lingered in Claire's ears long after the call had ended. She gripped the phone tightly, her breath coming in sharp, controlled exhales as she stared at the darkened screen. "She's not safe." 2 words, barely audible, but carrying the weight of something far greater than fear. Warning, plea, threat. She wasn't sure which. The air outside Lucas Carter's house had turned colder, the night stretching endlessly across the empty streets of Ridgewood. Claire scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that someone had been watching her. But the darkness swallowed everything whole. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows along the pavement. She shoved her phone back into her coat pocket and climbed into her car, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel as she considered her next move. Who had called her? And why now? Someone wanted her to keep digging. Someone knew what had really happened to Evelyn Carter that night. She couldn't shake the image of Lucas's face when she had confronted him about the footprint. That flicker of something, recognition, maybe even fear, before he carefully masked it with indifference. He was hiding something. He had always been hiding something. Claire pulled out of the driveway, her headlights cutting through the thick of the night as she made her way back to the station. The Carter case file was spread across her desk like a fragmented puzzle, the edges of its mysteries fraying with time. She flipped through the reports once more, searching for anything she might have missed. Her gaze landed on an old witness statement. Samuel Whitaker, the neighbor who had lived across from the Carter estate at the time of the fire. He had told police that he had seen movement near the house just minutes before the flames erupted. A shadowy figure, slipping through the trees. But no one had followed up. The case had been closed too quickly, tied up with neat little bows of accident and tragedy. Claire grabbed her coat. She needed to talk to Samuel Whitaker. The drive to his house took less than 10 minutes. The Whitaker home was one of the oldest in Ridgewood, a sagging Victorian with peeling paint and windows that seemed to peer out into the night like tired, weathered eyes. The porch light buzzed faintly, flickering in the cold wind as Claire knocked on the door. There was a long pause, then slow, deliberate footsteps. The door creaked open an inch, revealing a pale, lined face, eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Mr. Whitaker?" Claire asked. The old man's gaze swept over her, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're with the police," he said. Not a question, but a quiet statement of resignation. Claire nodded. "I need to ask you about the night of the Carter fire." Whitaker exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the crisp night air. "Been a long time since someone's asked about that." "That's exactly why I need to know what you saw," Claire said. "The case might not be as closed as everyone thought." A flicker of something crossed Whitaker's face. Hesitation, uncertainty. But then he opened the door wider, gesturing for her to come inside. The house smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of scent that clung to forgotten places. The furniture was sparse, the walls lined with faded photographs of people long gone. Whitaker moved slowly, leading her to the small sitting room where an oil lamp flickered on the table, casting warm, uneven light. Claire sat across from him, pulling out her notebook. "You told the police you saw someone near the Carter estate the night of the fire." Whitaker nodded, his fingers twitching slightly as he laced them together. "I did. Did you recognize them?" A pause. Then, softer than before, "No." Claire studied him carefully. "But you saw something." Whitaker exhaled, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I was out on my porch that night. Couldn't sleep. Something about the air felt wrong. Heavy. Then I saw it, movement near the tree line, just beyond the Carter house. A figure, slipping between the trees, moving too carefully, like they didn't want to be seen." Claire leaned forward. "A man or a woman?" Whitaker hesitated. Could have been either. But they weren't alone. A chill ran down Claire's spine. "What do you mean?" "They were carrying something," Whitaker said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or someone." The room seemed to close in around them. Claire's pulse quickened. "You think it was Evelyn?" she said. Not a question, a realization. Whitaker nodded slowly. "I never told the police that part. Didn't seem like it would matter after they ruled it an accident. But now I'm not so sure." Claire's fingers tightened around her pen. If someone had taken Evelyn that night, it meant she hadn't died in that fire. And it meant that someone had gone to great lengths to make the world believe that she had. Claire stood abruptly, tucking her notebook into her coat. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. You've been a great help." Whitaker watched her, his expression clouded with something unreadable. "Detective," he said as she reached the door. She turned back. "Be careful who you trust." The words settled heavily in Claire's chest as she stepped outside, the wind biting against her skin. The night stretched before her, vast and unforgiving, but now the path forward was clear. She wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. She was chasing a girl who had been stolen from the world, and she wasn't going to stop until she found her. The cold night pressed in around Claire as she left Samuel Whitaker's house, his warning echoing in her mind. Be careful who you trust. Those words carried weight, an ominous undercurrent that sent a shiver through her spine. She had spent years following the truth, unraveling the hidden layers of cases most had long given up on. But this one was different. It was personal, not for her, but for everyone in Ridgewood. She climbed into her car, locking the doors out of instinct. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her notebook, flipping to the page where she had written down Whitaker's account. A shadowy figure, a child being carried away. The implications were staggering. Someone had taken Evelyn Carter from that house. Someone had let the fire consume everything, erasing all traces of her existence. Claire's fingers hovered over her phone. She needed to process everything, to go over the facts again, but she couldn't do it alone. Her gut told her that Nathan Carter, despite his reluctance, still had more to say. He had lived with this tragedy, carried the weight of it for 10 years. If there was anyone who could help her put the missing pieces together, it was him. She dialed his number. It rang once, twice. Then the line picked up. A pause. The sound of breathing on the other end. Then Nathan's voice, rough and guarded. I told you to stop digging. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel. I can't do that, Nathan. I just spoke to Samuel Whitaker. He saw someone carrying a child away from your house the night of the fire. Silence. Then, barely above a whisper, you need to leave this alone. Claire's pulse quickened. Nathan, I think Evelyn is still alive. I think someone took her. And I think you know more than you're letting on. A sharp intake of breath. Then the line went dead. Claire cursed under her breath, shoving her phone onto the passenger seat. He was scared. That much was obvious. But was he scared for Evelyn? Or of the truth? She needed answers. And if Nathan wouldn't give them to her willingly, she would have to force his hand. She turned the key in the ignition, the engine growling to life. The road stretched before her, dark and empty, leading toward the Carter estate. She had no doubt that Nathan would go there. Maybe he already had. She just had to get there before someone else did. The Carter estate was as silent as a graveyard when Claire pulled into the overgrown driveway. The remains of the house loomed in the moonlight, its charred skeleton casting long, eerie shadows across the property. She stepped out of the car, her breath curling in the cold air. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the branches like whispering voices. Claire scanned the area, her fingers twitching toward her flashlight. There were no other cars, no signs of Nathan, but something felt wrong. She moved cautiously, stepping over fallen beams and cracked stone. The remains of the front porch creaked beneath her weight as she reached the threshold. Then a sound, a faint shuffling from inside the ruins. Claire's heart pounded. She reached for her flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the hollowed-out remains of what had once been the living room. The fireplace was still partially intact, its edges blackened with soot. Then movement. A shadow flickered just beyond the collapsed hallway. Claire's breath hitched. Who's there? She called out, her voice firm. No answer, but the shadow moved. Claire stepped forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. The floor was uneven, treacherous, but she kept going. The air smelled of damp earth and old smoke, the weight of the past pressing down on her. Then she saw it. A small figure huddled near the remains of the staircase, barely visible in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. A child. Claire's grip on the flashlight tightened. Evelyn? She whispered, her voice barely more than breath. The figure shifted, eyes wide, unblinking, reflecting the light. A rush of adrenaline shot through Claire's veins. It was a child, a girl, and she was real. Evelyn. Claire tried again, softer this time. She crouched slightly, keeping her movements slow, deliberate. It's okay. I'm here to help you. The girl didn't move, but she didn't run either. Claire swallowed hard. You don't have to be afraid. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind, the distant creak of the burned beams settling in the cold. Then a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Claire's breath hitched. The voice was small, fragile. Before she could say anything else, something crashed behind her. She spun around just as a dark figure lunged from the shadows. Pain exploded in her skull. A white-hot burst as something hard struck the side of her head. Her vision blurred. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. She hit the floor. Darkness swallowed her whole. Claire woke to the sound of muffled voices. Pain throbbed in her skull, her senses sluggish, disoriented. The air was cold, too cold. Her body ached from where she had fallen, and as she blinked away the haze, she realized she was still inside the Carter estate. The flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam casting eerie shadows along the ruined walls. She wasn't alone. A figure loomed near the girl. Evelyn. No, not Evelyn. Nathan. Claire's pulse roared in her ears. She tried to move, but a sharp pain lanced through her side. She groaned, the sound barely escaping her lips. Nathan turned sharply, his face contorted in a mixture of fear and anger. His eyes darted between Claire and the girl. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice thick with something Claire couldn't quite place. Claire gritted her teeth, pushing herself up onto her elbows. "She's alive." Nathan's jaw clenched. Claire forced herself upright, her head still swimming. "You knew," she said, her voice shaking with the realization. "You knew she was alive this whole time." Nathan's expression twisted with pain. "I didn't have a choice." Claire's breath came in short, ragged bursts. "You took her," she whispered. "You took Evelyn from that house the night of the fire." Nathan shook his head violently. No, you don't understand." "Then make me understand," Claire said, her voice raw. "Because right now, all I see is a man who let the world believe his daughter was dead for 10 years. Nathan's shoulders sagged, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "I didn't take her," he said finally. "But I know who did." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" Nathan hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the girl. Then a sound. Footsteps. Outside. Claire turned, her heart hammering. Someone else was here. Nathan's face went pale. "We need to go. Now." Before Claire could react, the door to the ruins burst open. A dark figure stood in the threshold. And then a single, chilling sentence. "You weren't supposed to find her." The figure in the doorway loomed, casting a long shadow against the crumbling remains of the Carter estate. The cold air curled through the open space, carrying the weight of something unseen. Danger. Claire felt it settle deep in her chest, a silent warning thrumming beneath her ribs. Nathan stepped instinctively in front of Evelyn, his body tense, fists clenched at his sides. The girl was small behind him, fragile, her wide eyes darting between Claire and the dark silhouette blocking their only exit. Claire's mind raced. Who was this? A threat? An ally? The person who had stolen Evelyn away all those years ago? "You weren't supposed to find her," the voice repeated, low and firm. Male, cold, unfamiliar. Claire pushed herself fully upright, ignoring the throbbing pain at the back of her skull. She had to think. Fast. The flashlight lay abandoned on the floor, casting weak, flickering light along the broken walls. The estate was too exposed, the exits too few. They were trapped. Nathan's voice broke the silence. "It's over. She's been found." A quiet chuckle, dark and knowing. "Is that what you think?" Claire's pulse pounded. She took a slow step forward, angling her body protectively near Evelyn. The girl didn't flinch, her face unreadable, too calm for a child who had spent 10 years in hiding. "Who are you?" Claire demanded. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering his answer. Then, with an unsettling kind of ease, he stepped fully into the ruined house. The dim light illuminated him in fragments. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair dusted with gray, eyes that held no warmth. Claire's breath hitched. She knew that face. It was Lucas Carter. Nathan exhaled sharply beside her. Claire saw his entire body stiffen, his hands balling into fists. "Lucas," Nathan said, his voice taut with barely contained rage. Claire felt the energy in the room shift. The quiet animosity that had always existed between the Carter brothers now burned in the open air, raw and exposed. "You should have stayed away," Lucas said, ignoring Claire entirely, his gaze fixed on Nathan. "This was never your fight." Nathan took a single step forward. "It was always my fight," he growled. "And you knew it." Claire's head spun, pieces of a puzzle finally snapping into place. Lucas Carter, the brother who had gained everything when the fire erased Catherine and Evelyn from the world. The one who had inherited the Carter fortune, who had been so eager to close the case, to bury the past. He had known. He had always known. Claire's breath came in short, sharp bursts. "You took her." Lucas turned to her then, finally acknowledging her presence. His expression was unreadable, but his lips quirked into something that might have been a smirk. "Took is a strong word." "She was a child," Claire said, her voice cold. "You stole her." Lucas sighed, his fingers grazing the dust-covered wall as he took another slow step into the room. "Stole her?" he mused. "Or saved her?" Silence. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs. "What the hell does that mean?" Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" His eyes flicked toward Evelyn, still frozen in place behind Nathan. "None of you do." Nathan's hands trembled. "You don't get to do this, Lucas. You don't get to rewrite history." Lucas's smile vanished. In the dim light, his expression hardened, and for the first time, Claire saw the man beneath the polished exterior, the monster hiding in plain sight. "I'm not rewriting anything," Lucas said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm telling you the truth, something neither of you could handle back then." Claire forced herself to stay calm. "Then tell us, right now." Lucas's jaw twitched. He glanced once at Evelyn, then back to Claire. She was never safe in that house. The words hung heavy in the air, suffocating. Nathan shook his head. "That's a lie." Lucas gave a humorless laugh. "Is it?" He turned his gaze to Claire. "Tell me, detective, have you read all of Catherine's journal?" Claire hesitated. Lucas's eyes darkened. "Of course you haven't. Because if you had, you'd know why she set that fire." Claire's breath caught. "She started the fire?" Lucas nodded once. "She had to. It was the only way to get Evelyn out." Nathan's entire body went rigid. "You're lying." Lucas shrugged. "Believe what you want. But Catherine knew something that none of you ever understood. She knew what was coming. She knew what would happen if she didn't act." Claire swallowed hard. "And what was coming?" Lucas's expression didn't change. "The people who wanted Evelyn dead." Nathan flinched. "That's not." "It is." Lucas cut him off, his voice sharp. "And you were too blind to see it. She did what you couldn't. She protected her." Claire's mind spun. None of this made sense, and yet it did. The fire, the disappearances, the secrets. Catherine had been trying to hide her daughter. From who? Claire forced herself to steady her voice. "You expect me to believe that Catherine burned down her own house to keep Evelyn safe?" Lucas's gaze was unforgiving. "I don't care what you believe. The only thing that matters is that it worked." Nathan's breathing had turned uneven. Claire could see the war raging in his eyes, the desperate need to deny, to reject everything his brother was saying. But deep down, he was remembering the way Catherine had changed in those final weeks, the way she had looked at Evelyn, as if she was constantly afraid. Claire turned to Evelyn then. The girl hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, but her eyes, they knew the truth. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. "Evelyn," she said softly, "who took you from the house that night?" The girl's gaze flickered to Lucas, then to Nathan. Claire felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Nathan sucked in a sharp breath. "No," he whispered. Evelyn's lips parted. "It wasn't Lucas." Claire's stomach twisted. "Then who was it?" The girl exhaled shakily, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You." The room tilted. Claire stopped breathing. Nathan stumbled backward, his face drained of all color. Claire's ears rang. "What?" Evelyn swallowed. "You took me," she said, her voice small but steady. "You carried me away before the fire got too bad. You told me to be quiet, that we had to go." Nathan shook his head violently. No, I would have remembered that." Lucas exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Memories are a funny thing, brother." Claire's world tilted violently. Nathan had been the one. Nathan had taken Evelyn from the house. And he didn't remember. The truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. Nathan Carter had been the hero of this story all along. And he never knew it. Silence filled the air. Then Lucas let out a slow, measured breath. "Now do you see?" Claire did. And nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of Evelyn's words pressed down on the room like an invisible force. Suffocating, inescapable. Nathan Carter had spent 10 years believing he had failed his daughter, believing that the fire had taken her just as it had taken Catherine. And now, standing in the ruins of the house that had once been their home, he was being told the impossible truth. He had saved Evelyn that night. His breathing came in short, ragged bursts. His mind was a storm, fractured images flashing behind his eyes. Smoke, heat, the glow of the flames swallowing the walls around him. The panic, the need to run, and then nothing. Blankness. He shook his head. No, this isn't right. This isn't how it happened. "I don't remember," he whispered, his voice hoarse, raw. His hands trembled at his sides. "I don't." Lucas sighed, shaking his head. "Of course you don't. You blocked it out. Do you have any idea how much trauma can warp the mind? Nathan? How much guilt can bury the truth?" Claire stood frozen, her own mind reeling. She had walked into this investigation believing Evelyn had been taken from her home that night. And now, the truth was unraveling into something even more complicated, more devastating. Nathan hadn't failed. He had done what any father would have done. He had carried his daughter to safety. And yet, for 10 years, he had lived in the shadow of a grief that was never real. Claire forced herself to find her voice. If Nathan took Evelyn from the house, then why was she hidden all these years? Why didn't she come back? Lucas gave a humorless chuckle. Because bringing her back would have meant killing her. Nathan snapped his head up. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lucas exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if he were growing tired of explaining things to children. "Nathan, you still don't get it, do you? That fire wasn't an accident. And it wasn't some tragic mistake. It was meant to erase Evelyn." Claire felt her stomach twist. Who would want to kill a child? Lucas's expression darkened. "Not just anyone. Our own father." Silence. Nathan's breath hitched. "No," he said, shaking his head violently. "That's not..." Dad was strict, but he wouldn't. Lucas cut him off. Strict? He was a goddamn tyrant, Nathan. He controlled everything, every part of this family. He dictated who we could talk to, where we could go. And when Catherine married you, he saw her as a problem, a weakness. But Evelyn, she was worse. She was a threat. Claire felt cold all over. A threat to what? Lucas's gaze flickered toward Evelyn, then back to Nathan. His voice dropped lower, more measured. A threat to the Carter name. Nathan clenched his jaw. That doesn't make sense. Lucas exhaled, as if the conversation itself exhausted him. You always were the naive one, he muttered. You think our father would have let you raise Evelyn? That he would have let Catherine, let anyone take control of what he saw as his legacy. He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. He ordered the fire, Nathan. He made sure there would be nothing left. No Catherine, no Evelyn, no loose ends. Claire felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Nathan swayed slightly, his entire body rigid. Their father had tried to kill his granddaughter. Lucas kept going, his voice sharp. Catherine found out. She knew what was coming. That's why she set the fire herself. To make it look like she died first, to create chaos, to buy time. She knew the only way to save Evelyn was to make the world believe she was already gone. Nathan's hands trembled. His head throbbed with fragmented memories, pieces of a puzzle he had never allowed himself to solve. "The last thing I remember," he whispered, "was Catherine telling me to go, to take Evelyn and go." Lucas nodded. "She knew if you stayed, our father would find you, so she did the only thing she could. She disappeared. And you," his lips curled into something bitter, "you buried the memory so deep you forgot what really happened." Nathan staggered back, as if the truth had physically struck him. "Catherine's alive?" Lucas exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "She was. For a while." Claire felt her heart stop. "What do you mean, was?" Lucas hesitated. "She ran. She had to. For years, she stayed in the shadows, watching from a distance. But eventually, she stopped running." Nathan's voice cracked. "She's dead." Lucas's silence was answer enough. Nathan squeezed his eyes shut. He had spent a decade mourning the wrong person. His wife had survived that night, lived in hiding, spent years protecting their daughter from the man who had tried to erase them both. And now she was gone. Claire swallowed hard, struggling to keep her voice steady. "And your father?" Lucas scoffed. "Died 2 years ago. The bastard never paid for what he did. But he was already rotting long before he hit the grave." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn hadn't moved, hadn't spoken since revealing the truth about Nathan. Claire turned to her now, her heart aching for this girl who had been forced to grow up in the shadows, a child who had never known the warmth of the family that should have protected her. "Evelyn," she said gently, "did your mother ever tell you about this?" Evelyn hesitated. Then, quietly, "She told me my grandfather was a bad man." Nathan inhaled sharply, his eyes filling with something indescribable. Regret, pain, love. Claire looked between them. "You don't have to hide anymore," she told Evelyn. "You don't have to be afraid." Lucas made a low sound in the back of his throat. "Afraid?" he echoed, shaking his head. "Detective, you still don't understand, do you?" Claire frowned. "Understand what?" Lucas exhaled, stepping closer. "I didn't just hide Evelyn for 10 years because of our father. There were others, people who worked for him, people who would do anything to finish what he started." Claire's blood ran cold. "Who?" she asked. Lucas's eyes met hers. "We'll find out soon enough." Then a noise outside, a rustle in the trees. Footsteps. Claire's body went rigid. Someone was out there. Lucas moved first, grabbing Evelyn's wrist. "We need to leave. Now." Nathan shook his head, snapping out of his daze. "You're not taking her anywhere without me." Lucas's jaw clenched, but there was no time to argue. Claire reached for her gun, keeping her eyes locked on the open doorway. The air had shifted, thick with unseen danger. Someone was watching. Someone had followed them here. And whoever they were, they weren't alone. The wind outside howled like a warning, rattling the skeletal remains of the Carter estate. Claire stood frozen, her pulse a violent drumbeat in her ears. Footsteps, a rustle just beyond the threshold. The unmistakable presence of someone, or several someones, lurking in the darkness. Lucas tensed beside her, his grip tightening on Evelyn's wrist. Nathan was already moving, stepping in front of his daughter, his body a living shield. For 10 years, Evelyn had been hidden in the shadows, protected from the ghosts of a past she had barely lived through. And now those ghosts had come to collect. Claire inhaled sharply, her fingers steadying around the grip of her gun. "Think, Reynolds. Think." The exit was too exposed. The back of the estate was a ruin, no clear path out. The second floor had collapsed years ago. They were boxed in. A voice broke through the silence. Low, controlled, amused. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be." Claire felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew that voice. Nathan's hands curled into fists. Lucas let out a slow, measured breath. Evelyn barely moved. Claire took a step forward, her gun raised. "Step into the light." A chuckle. "Come on, detective. You know how this works." She did. She hated that she did. A shadow shifted near the trees. Then another. More movement. They weren't alone. Lucas exhaled through his nose. You should have stayed buried, Damien. Claire's pulse spiked. Damien Calloway. She had spent years knowing his name, hearing it whispered in conversations that were meant to be private. Fixer. A ghost. A man who lived in the spaces between the law and the people who bent it. And once he had worked for James Carter, Evelyn's grandfather. Funny, Damien mused, stepping closer. The weak moonlight barely illuminated his face, but Claire could see the sharp angles, the cold smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. I was just about to say the same thing to you. Nathan's voice was lethal. What do you want? Damien tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity. Now, Nathan, that's an interesting question. What do I want? Do I want to settle old debts? Do I want to remind you that ghosts don't stay buried? Or, he shifted slightly, eyes landing on Evelyn. Do I want to finish what your father started? Nathan lunged. Lucas caught him just in time, yanking him back before he could reach Damien. Claire's grip on her gun never wavered, but her mind was spinning. What the hell was Damien doing here? Why now? Damien sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw like he was already bored of the conversation. Look, I'm just here for the girl. It's nothing personal. Lucas let out a bitter laugh. Nothing personal? You tried to kill her before she could even walk. Damien spread his hands. Orders, Lucas. I was following orders. You of all people should understand how that works. Claire's stomach twisted. It had been real. The danger, the threats, the fire, it had all been real. James Carter had ordered his granddaughter's death, and Damien Calloway had been the one sent to make it happen. Nathan's entire body was trembling. You're not taking her. Damien arched a brow. Nathan, you took her first. Silence. Lucas stiffened. Claire felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Damien's smile sharpened. What, you thought you figured it out all on your own? That your repressed memories were just some tragic accident? He scoffed. I let you take her, Nathan. I let you. Nathan's breath hitched. You're lying. Damien smirked. Am I? Claire could see it in Nathan's face. The unraveling. The truth scratching at the edges of his mind. The memories he had buried so deep finally clawing their way back to the surface. The night of the fire. The smoke. The chaos. Catherine's voice. Frantic. Take her and don't look back. And then another voice. Low, calm. Damien's voice. Run, Nathan. If you want to save her, you run. And you forget this night ever happened. Claire's entire body went rigid. Lucas cursed under his breath. Nathan's breathing was shallow. Why? His voice was barely a whisper. Why did you let me take her? Damien smiled, slow and deliberate. Because it was more fun that way. Claire's skin crawled. Damien took another step forward. I was going to find her eventually, Nathan. But watching you lose your mind for 10 years? Watching you suffer? Watching you forget what you had done? His smirk widened. That was worth the wait. Nathan lunged again, and this time, Claire didn't stop him. He crashed into Damien, the force sending them both staggering back onto the uneven ground. They struggled, bodies colliding, fists swinging wildly. Lucas moved to help, but Claire caught his arm. No, she said, shaking her head. We get Evelyn out of here. Lucas hesitated for half a second before nodding. He grabbed Evelyn's wrist. Come on, kid. Evelyn didn't move. Claire turned to her. Evelyn, we need to go. The girl's wide, dark eyes locked onto Nathan and Damien. He helped us, she whispered. Claire faltered. What? Evelyn's gaze flickered to Claire. That night, he told my dad to run. Lucas swore. Damien had saved them? But if that was true, then... Damien suddenly twisted, yanking something from his coat. A knife, sharp, gleaming in the moonlight. Claire reacted on instinct. Gun raised, finger on the trigger. Damien, she warned, but he was laughing. Relax, detective. If I wanted him dead, he'd already be gone. Nathan staggered back, breathing hard. Damien dusted himself off like he had barely been touched. Listen, I could kill you all right now. But the truth is, he sighed dramatically, I don't care anymore. Claire frowned. Then why come back? Damien's smirk turned into something darker. Because someone else does. Silence. Claire's stomach sank. Who? Damien tilted his head. You really think James Carter was the only one who wanted Evelyn gone? A chill ran down Claire's spine. Nathan's voice was hoarse. Who is it? Damien took a step back, disappearing into the shadows. You'll find out soon enough. Then, just like that, he was gone. The wind howled around them, filling the space where he had stood just moments ago. Claire's grip on her gun was tight, her knuckles white. Lucas exhaled sharply. Well, that's bad. Nathan was shaking. He let me take her. He cut himself off, eyes wild. If he's not the real threat, then who the hell is? Claire swallowed hard. She didn't know, but something told her they were about to find out. The night pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. Claire stood motionless, gun still gripped tightly in her hands, her breath coming in uneven bursts. Damien was gone, disappeared into the darkness like a ghost, leaving nothing behind but a warning that sank deep into her bones. You really think James Carter was the only one who wanted Evelyn gone? Nathan was still shaking, his breathing erratic, his body coiled like a wire pulled too tight. His mind was spiraling, barely keeping hold of reality. He had spent 10 years believing he lost Evelyn, spent 10 years grieving her, only to learn that he had saved her, that he had been the one to take her from the fire. And now, to learn that Damien, the very man who had been hunting her, had let them go all those years ago? It was too much. Lucas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I hate to be the one to say this, but we need to get the hell out of here. Right now. Evelyn hadn't moved. She was still watching the spot where Damien had stood, her dark eyes unreadable. Claire took a slow step forward, lowering her gun. Evelyn, she said carefully, we need to go somewhere safe. Evelyn turned her head slightly. There isn't anywhere safe. The words sent a chill through Claire's spine. She wasn't wrong. Nathan finally seemed to snap back to reality. His eyes darted to Claire, then to Lucas. If Damien isn't the one pulling the strings, then who is? Lucas let out a bitter chuckle. I don't think we want to find out. Claire gritted her teeth. We don't have a choice. Nathan inhaled sharply, running a shaking hand through his hair. We need to get out of town. Evelyn isn't safe here. Lucas frowned. And where do you plan on going? We have no idea who we're running from, or where they are, or how many of them there are. Claire nodded slowly. Which is exactly why we stay. We don't run blind. We find out who the real threat is, and we take control of the situation. Nathan shook his head violently. No, we don't risk her life. Claire's voice was firm. She's been in hiding for 10 years, and it hasn't stopped them from coming after her. Running isn't the answer. Nathan clenched his jaw, but he knew she was right. He hated it, but he knew. Lucas exhaled. All right, then what's the plan, genius? Claire turned toward Evelyn. You need to tell me everything your mother told you. Every name, every warning, everything she knew. Evelyn hesitated. Then finally she spoke. She told me about my grandfather, she said softly. She told me he was dangerous, that he wasn't the only one who wanted to hurt me. But she never said who they were. Claire frowned. Nothing? No names. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. Just one. Nathan stiffened. Who? Evelyn swallowed hard. Then, her lips parted, and she whispered the name that shattered everything. Margaret Carter. The world seemed to tilt. Claire blinked. Wait, Margaret Carter? As in your... My grandmother, Evelyn said. Lucas let out a sharp breath. No, that doesn't make sense. Nathan's voice was hoarse. She died before Evelyn was born. Evelyn turned toward him. No, she didn't. Claire felt her blood run cold. Nathan's body locked up, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. Evelyn, that's not possible. Evelyn shook her head. That's what Mom told me. She said my grandmother was still alive. That she was the one who ordered the fire. Not Grandpa. Silence. Lucas looked pale. Dad was following orders? Claire inhaled sharply. Margaret Carter had been dead for over a decade. Or at least that's what everyone believed. But what if she wasn't? What if she had been pulling the strings from the shadows all along? Nathan took an unsteady step back, his mind reeling. No, he whispered. No, that's not possible. I remember her funeral. I remember. But even as he spoke, the doubt was already settling in his chest. Claire's pulse pounded. If she's alive, then where is she? Evelyn hesitated. Then softly, she's been watching. Claire felt a chill crawl down her spine. Watching? Evelyn nodded. Mom told me. She said that if she ever stopped running, if she ever stopped hiding me, my grandmother would come for me. Lucas let out a shaky breath. Jesus Christ. Nathan exhaled sharply, raking his fingers through his hair. That's why Catherine never came back. She knew Margaret was still out there. She knew it wasn't over. Claire's hands trembled. And if Margaret is still alive, and if she's still pulling the strings, Lucas finished the thought. Then she's the one coming for Evelyn. A tense, suffocating silence filled the night air. Claire forced herself to stay calm. Okay, if she's alive, we find her. We stop this before she can make a move. Nathan's eyes burned with something dangerous. And if we don't? Lucas exhaled. Then we'll never see her coming. A new kind of fear settled in Claire's chest. Margaret Carter wasn't just alive. She was waiting. The revelation hung in the air like a noose tightening around their throats. Margaret Carter was alive. The woman who had supposedly died years before Evelyn was born. The matriarch of the Carter family. The unseen force lurking behind the fire, behind everything. Claire could feel it now, a deep, sinking weight in her gut. Margaret had never been gone. She had just been waiting. Nathan's body was rigid, his hands clenched so tightly at his sides that Claire thought he might break. His entire life had been built on a lie. His mother had never been buried in a grave he had mourned at. She had been out there orchestrating everything. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse and disbelieving. She's alive. Evelyn nodded, her voice soft but sure. Mom told me. Lucas exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. I need a goddamn drink. Claire ignored him, her mind spinning. If she's been alive all this time, why wait? Why now? Nathan shook his head, still trapped in his own storm of thoughts. We need proof. His voice was sharper now, more desperate. If she's alive, if she's really behind this, then we need to find her. We don't find her, Lucas interrupted. She finds us. The words sent an eerie chill down Claire's spine. Nathan turned sharply toward him. And how the hell do you know that? Lucas let out a dry chuckle, devoid of humor. Because I spent my entire life watching our parents play games with people's lives. Nathan. And you know what the worst part is? Dad was predictable. He was a monster. But at least you knew what you were dealing with. His voice dropped lower. Mom was worse. Silence. Lucas glanced at Evelyn, then back at Nathan. She's always been the real power in this family. Everything Dad did, every decision he made, every accident that happened along the way, he never moved without her permission. And when she died, it wasn't because she was sick. It was because she was planning something, preparing for something. And now, after all this time, she's finally making her move. Claire swallowed hard. What does she want? Lucas looked at her like she was missing the obvious. She wants Evelyn gone, just like she always did. Evelyn's small fingers curled into fists, but her expression remained eerily blank. Why? Lucas let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Because you weren't supposed to exist. Nathan inhaled sharply. Claire frowned. What do you mean? Lucas crossed his arms. Mom had plans for this family. Strict plans. The Carter legacy was supposed to be untouchable. She spent her entire life making sure it stayed that way. And when Nathan married Catherine, someone she didn't approve of, she tolerated it. Barely. But when Evelyn was born, his voice darkened. She saw her as a weakness, as something that would ruin everything. Nathan's hands were shaking now. She tried to kill my daughter. Lucas met his gaze, and for once, there was no smirk, no sarcasm. Just the cold, bitter truth. Yeah, she did. Silence. Nathan exhaled, shaking his head. So what do? We can't run forever. And if Damien was telling the truth, he was, Claire interjected. Nathan hesitated, then nodded. If he was telling the truth, that means she's been watching, waiting. That means she's already close. Claire felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. Margaret Carter was here, somewhere, and they were running out of time. Lucas sighed. Well, lucky for you, I have an idea. Nathan turned to him. What kind of idea? Lucas smirked. We make her come to us. Claire narrowed her eyes. How? Lucas's smirk widened. We make her think she's already won. Nathan exhaled sharply. I don't like this. Good, Lucas said. That means it might actually work. Claire looked between them, her mind already working through the possibilities. Explain. Lucas leaned against the broken frame of the estate, crossing his arms. Mom's smart. She's patient, but she's also arrogant as hell. If we go into hiding, she wins. If we run, she gets what she wants. But if we give her exactly what she's been waiting for, his smirk turned razor sharp. We flush her out. Nathan clenched his jaw. And what exactly does that mean? Lucas shrugged. We make it look like Evelyn is vulnerable, like she's alone, like she's right where Mom wants her. Claire's stomach twisted. You want to use a child as bait? Lucas rolled his eyes. Oh, please. You think Mom wouldn't already be watching? She already knows where we are. This isn't about if she's coming. It's about when. Nathan exhaled sharply, his eyes flickering toward his daughter. Evelyn still hadn't moved, still hadn't reacted. Finally, she spoke. I'll do it. Nathan's entire body locked up. No. Evelyn met his gaze, unflinching. She'll never stop, Dad. Not unless we stop her first. Nathan's throat worked, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. She was right. She had lived her entire life in the shadows, running from a woman she had never even met. It had to end. Nathan swallowed hard. We do this my way. We control every variable. We don't let her get close enough to touch you. Lucas smirked. Fine by me. Claire exhaled. We need a location. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere we can control the situation. Lucas tilted his head. Actually, I think we already have one. Nathan frowned. Where? Lucas's smirk widened. Home. Silence. Nathan's stomach twisted. You want to do this at the Carter estate? Lucas's gaze darkened. Why not? Mom built that house with her own hands. Let's make her watch it burn. Claire exhaled, shaking her head. This is insane. Lucas grinned. I know. Nathan turned to Claire. Are you in? She hesitated. Then finally she nodded. We end this, she said. Nathan exhaled. We end this. Evelyn looked between them, her small voice steady. Good. The plan was set. Margaret Carter was coming. And this time, they were ready. The Carter estate stood like a specter against the night, its burned-out remains barely holding together after years of decay. The air was thick with anticipation, each breath carrying the weight of what was about to unfold. Nathan stood near the front steps, his fingers twitching at his sides. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to take Evelyn far away from here, but there was nowhere left to go. This had to end tonight. Claire was already in position, crouched near the collapsed remains of what had once been the study. She had a clear line of sight to the entrance, her gun steady in her grip. Lucas stood to the side, arms crossed, his usual smirk absent. There was no room for arrogance now. They had set the stage. Now they had to wait. Evelyn sat on the broken steps of the porch, her small frame almost swallowed by the darkness. The plan was simple, Make Margaret Carter believe she had already won. Make her step out of the shadows and into the open. Lucas had been right. Margaret wasn't the kind of person who took risks unless she believed she had already secured the outcome. If she thought Evelyn was vulnerable, if she thought Nathan had been broken beyond repair, she would come. And when she did, they would be ready. Nathan exhaled sharply, forcing his mind to still. Every muscle in his body ached from years of tension, from carrying the weight of a grief he had never truly needed to bear. His mother had been alive this whole time, watching, waiting, manipulating. He clenched his jaw. Not anymore. A sound cut through the night. A car. Nathan's breath hitched. Claire stiffened, her grip tightening around the gun. Lucas's head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. Evelyn didn't move. The vehicle slowed as it approached the estate, the tires crunching against the gravel driveway. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the ruined house for the first time in years. Then the engine went silent. Nathan's fingers curled into fists. This was it. The car door opened. A figure stepped out. Nathan's blood ran cold. She stood tall, her posture perfect, her coat buttoned neatly despite the wind whipping through the night. Her silver hair was pulled back into an elegant twist, her face untouched by time. Margaret Carter. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. The last time he had seen his mother, she had been lowered into the ground. And yet, here she was, alive, whole, as if she had never left. She took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the gravel. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the scene before settling on Evelyn. A smile, small, calculated. "So," Margaret said, her voice smooth as silk, "you finally stopped running." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Lucas let out a low whistle. "You look good for a dead woman." Margaret's gaze flicked to him. Lucas, always the disappointment. Lucas smirked, but there was no humor in it. "And yet, here I am, alive, unlike dear old Dad." Margaret exhaled through her nose, unimpressed. James was reckless. He never knew when to stop pushing. Nathan's hands trembled. "You ordered the fire." Margaret turned to him, and for the first time in his life he saw it. The truth. She had never been warm, never been kind. But he had spent his childhood convincing himself that there had been something, anything, inside her that resembled love. But now, staring at her under the cold moonlight, he knew better. Her lips curved ever so slightly. "Of course I did." A rush of anger surged through him, hot and blinding. "She was your granddaughter." Margaret tilted her head. "And yet here she is, still breathing." Her gaze flickered toward Evelyn again. "A shame, really." Nathan lunged before he even realized what he was doing. Claire barely caught him in time, stepping between them, her gun raised. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "Not like this." Margaret smiled. "Ah, the detective. Still so desperate to save something that isn't worth saving." Claire's jaw clenched. "You're done, Margaret. Whatever power you think you still have, whatever influence, it's over." Margaret chuckled, soft and amused. "Oh, my dear, naive girl. You really don't understand, do you?" Nathan's breath came fast, ragged. "Understand what?" Margaret met his gaze, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "This was never about Evelyn," she said smoothly. "This was always about you." Nathan's pulse stopped. Margaret took another step forward. "Did you ever wonder why you don't remember that night? Why your memories of the fire are nothing but fragments?" Nathan's body locked up. Claire frowned. "What are you talking about?" Margaret smiled. "You're so eager to believe you saved your daughter, Nathan. But tell me, are you sure that's what happened?" Silence. A different kind of silence. The kind that destroys. Nathan's mouth went dry. "No," he whispered. "No, you're lying." Margaret sighed, shaking her head. "Oh, Nathan. Always so gullible." Lucas's voice was sharp. "Just say it." Margaret's gaze never left Nathan's. "You didn't save Evelyn that night." Nathan froze. Margaret's voice was soft, almost pitying. "You started the fire." Nathan felt the world collapse. His knees nearly buckled. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. No, that's not true. That's not possible. Claire's head snapped toward Margaret. You're lying, Margaret hummed. Am I? Nathan's mind was spiraling. He saw it now, the smoke, the chaos, the screaming. Catherine's voice, pleading. Take her, Nathan. Take her and run. But there was something else. Something he had buried. Something he had refused to remember. His own hands striking the match. Nathan's breath caught. Margaret's smile widened. Oh, Nathan, you never were the hero of this story. Silence. Then, the sound of sirens in the distance. Claire's voice was sharp, steady. You're done, Margaret. Margaret didn't move. She didn't even look surprised. Nathan could barely breathe. Lucas exhaled. Well, that's a hell of a twist. Margaret turned her gaze toward Evelyn one last time. You'll never be free of this family, she said softly. None of you will. Then, the police arrived, and it was over. But Nathan knew it would never really be over. Because Margaret was right. He wasn't the hero. He never had been. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, sharper, slicing through the thick weight of what Margaret had just said. Nathan started the fire. The words echoed inside his skull, reverberating with a force that made his knees buckle, his breath shallow. It wasn't possible. Couldn't be true. But the moment she said it, something inside him cracked. The memories clawed their way to the surface. Fragments, splinters of a night buried so deep that his mind had spent 10 years refusing to touch them. He saw the flames flickering in his own reflection. He heard Catherine's voice, desperate, panicked. Take her, Nathan. Take her and run. The match in his hand, the acrid scent of burning wood, the undeniable truth unraveling before him. Lucas's voice was the first thing to break through the haze. Well, that's a hell of a revelation. Nathan barely heard him. Margaret was watching him. Not gloating, not triumphant, just waiting. Waiting for the realization to take hold. Claire stepped forward, her jaw tight, gun still raised. Nathan. She's lying. Nathan's breathing was erratic. His entire body felt like it was shutting down. But was she? Was she really? Margaret tilted her head. Oh, detective. You're too smart to believe that. Lucas crossed his arms. Okay, let's break this down. Shall we? You're telling us that Nathan, of all people, burned down his own house with his wife and daughter inside. He scoffed. I gotta say, Mom, that sounds more like something you'd do. Margaret didn't blink. No, Lucas. What I do is calculated. What Nathan did was desperate. Nathan clenched his fists, his head pounding. You're lying. Am I? Margaret took a slow step forward. Think, Nathan. Think about that night. Think about what really happened. Nathan swallowed hard. Catherine started the fire. Margaret let out a soft chuckle. Oh, darling. She only thought she did. Silence. A new kind of silence. Nathan could feel Claire watching him. Feel Lucas shifting uncomfortably. He could feel Evelyn's gaze, her small body still and unreadable. The police were almost here. They had seconds before all of this unraveled into something that none of them could control. Claire exhaled sharply. It doesn't matter. Margaret, you're finished. The police are coming, and whether or not you staged your own death, you're going away for everything you've done. Margaret's lips curled into something almost pitying. You still don't get it, do you? Claire narrowed her eyes. Get what? Margaret's gaze flickered to Evelyn. You can't protect her. Lucas let out a sharp breath. Jesus, you just don't quit, do you? Margaret didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Evelyn. She is a Carter. She carries the weight of this name whether she wants to or not. And when she realizes that, she will have a choice. She will come to me. Nathan snapped out of his daze, rage surging through his veins like fire. She will never come to you. Margaret smiled. That's what Catherine thought too. The blue and red lights cut through the darkness, flashing against the burned remains of the house. Tires screeched against gravel. They were here. Claire turned sharply toward the approaching vehicles, signaling for them to stand down. Officers poured from their cars, guns drawn, voices shouting orders. But Margaret didn't move. Nathan expected her to run, to fight, to do something, but she just stood there, waiting, and that's when he knew. She had already planned for this. 2 officers rushed forward, grabbing her by the arms, forcing her wrists behind her back. She didn't struggle, didn't even flinch. Nathan's heart pounded. "What did you do?" Margaret met his gaze. "I already won." The words were soft, certain, terrifying. Nathan felt something in his chest crack open. He turned to Evelyn, expecting her to be afraid, expecting her to hide behind him. But instead, she was looking at Margaret. Not in fear, not in hatred, just watching. Margaret's gaze softened just a fraction. "We'll see each other again, my dear." Evelyn didn't say a word. And then, just like that, they took Margaret away. The night was still. The weight of everything crashed down all at once. Nathan exhaled shakily, his hands flexing at his sides. It was over. Claire lowered her gun, exhaustion sinking into her bones. Lucas let out a slow, deep breath. "Well, that was awful." Silence. Nathan turned to Evelyn. "Are you okay?" Evelyn nodded slowly, but there was something in her eyes that Nathan couldn't place. Something he didn't like. Claire turned toward the officers, speaking quietly with the lead detective. Lucas shoved his hands into his pockets, already preparing some sarcastic remark. Nathan crouched in front of his daughter, studying her. "Evelyn," he said gently. She met his gaze. "You know she's wrong, right?" Evelyn hesitated. Then finally she nodded. But something in his chest tightened. Margaret had lost. But something told him she had left something behind. And one day they would have to face it. But not tonight. Tonight they were free. For the first time in 10 years, Nathan could breathe. For the first time in 10 years, he had his daughter back. And for now, that was enough.